using the computer's mic. So okay, so let me just screen share. So is the slide visible to everybody?
Sir, I have a question regarding evaluation, if you will take it this time or at the end.
Pardon me, I will take a quiz after around 7 or 8 lectures.
Yes, yes. So what will be the format of the quiz? I mean, how is it different from a written midterm?
We will see. I have not figured that out yet.
Okay, sir.
Okay. Maybe some multiple choice questions or something like that. Let me think about this. Okay, it will be for 10 marks, and the midterm or the final for at the end of 16 lectures will be for 40 marks. Okay.
Okay, sir.
So anything else before we begin? Okay. So this is a paper which has been uploaded onto Teams, and I would strongly suggest that each one of you read this paper line by line very, very carefully. It is, according to me, one of the iconic papers in the area of stabilization. Okay, and it is an extremely well written paper. Okay, I hope at least some of you have read it before coming to class. And there is another paper that I have uploaded on cyclical ratcheting. So what's going to happen now? Today we are going to discuss a very verbal paper. There is no modeling here. So it is written in extremely lucid English. Okay. And the next paper that we will do, it is a paper that was published in the Review of Economics and Statistics, which models the ideas that have been put forward in this paper. Okay, so the econometric model that was estimated with this paper as the background is the next thing that we will do. So first the verbose paper, and then we will go to a paper which provides an econometric model of the ideas that were propounded in this one. Now, the ideas propounded in this paper are very, very fundamental ideas to macroeconomics. Okay, and this paper has had a very lasting influence on the way macroeconomics is modeled and macroeconomics is thought about. Okay, it is a rather old paper. It is written in 1976, if I'm not mistaken. There are two versions of the paper, so I've given you one version which is a later version, but there is an earlier version which they talk about in a footnote. But you can see the exact timing of the paper is not so important. What is more important is what is said here. Okay, now prior to the Great Depression, it was generally believed that so long as the prevailing institutions constrain monetary excesses, a free enterprise economy was self-adjusting within broad cyclical limits. Now, this is prior to the 1930s, right? Prior to the Great Depression. Okay, so prior to the Great Depression, the ideas propounded by Smith and his followers, and then Marshall, Pigou, and the rest of the neoclassical economists was the dominant, well-accepted paradigm. Okay, and that paradigm said that as long as central banks and governments behaved responsibly, a free enterprise economy was self-adjusting within broad cyclical limits. This is self-explanatory. And a balanced budget was one of the practical rules that reflected such constraints. So prior to the Great Depression, governments the world over, both by convention and by belief, okay, generally stuck to what was called the balanced budget principle. Okay, so this was one rule that if the government had no money, it didn't spend. Okay, so the size of the government was completely constrained by the amount of taxes that it could collect. Okay. Now, as against this, the Keynesian vision was one in which monetary management could not produce a self-correcting economy. More extensive discretionary management, which included fiscal policy, was required. So the Keynesian vision was a complete negation of the earlier uh, beliefs, so to speak. Okay, okay. Now, the extent to which thinking on these matters changed and its fallouts or its unintended consequences is what we are going to discuss today. In fact, as I must have, those of you who had taken my corporate finance course, I must have said it there, that economics is, after all, ultimately a study of unintended consequences. Okay. So policy actions either by households or by firms or by the government are going to have unintended consequences, and our subject as a whole tries to figure out what these unintended consequences are and whether anything can be done about that. Okay. Now, such discretionary management necessarily required eradication of the principled adherence to balanced budget. See, nowadays we take a budget deficits as a norm. Okay, I had pointed out that we have had in recent memory almost no years in which we had a balanced budget. Okay, we have always had a deficit budget. And this is true for most of the underdeveloped world and for a large part of the developed world as well. But the developed world, you can have instances of surplus budgets, as the Americans had shown in Clinton's time. They actually achieved a surplus budget. So in the advanced countries, the story is a little different, where large budget deficits are not common. But of course, it just depends. We have Greece on one hand, which had a huge problem. Okay, Portugal. There are other countries which are facing difficulties. Italy, for example. So it is difficult to make generalizations, but nevertheless, let's keep in mind that the underdeveloped countries have more of a problem in recent times with respect to this than the advanced countries. As we go on, this distinction between advanced and developed countries is again going to be a focus of our attention. But before we come to that, we just need to discuss some basic principles, which is what this paper does. Okay. Now, this paper by Buchanan and Wagner argues that the destruction of the balanced budget rule produced a political bias in the conduct of economic policy in a democratic society. Now, the words are important here. Now, mostly in macroeconomics, when you study macroeconomics for the first time, generally speaking, all textbooks do not focus on politics at all. Okay, the government is looked upon as a benevolent government, some kind of Ram Rajya that governments always want to do good. Okay, so you take any standard undergraduate text in macroeconomics. Uh, Politics forms a very, very small part of the discussion of macroeconomic issues. Okay, and this is the first paper in some sense that brings about the centrality of politics. Okay, and obviously, if you are going to talk about the centrality of politics to macroeconomic policy, then you have to assume a democratic society. Okay, how politics will play out in a dictatorship can never really be theoretically well understood. It is very, very difficult. Okay, so for macroeconomists to bring political issues to bear on the formulation and conduct of monetary policy, the assumption of a democratic society is critical. But notice that not all societies are democratic. Okay, or in many societies, the democratic order and the democratic institutions, for example, in large parts of Asia and sub-Saharan Africa, the whole of Africa, in fact, and nearer home, the Middle East, this is some kind of a ridiculous assumption, right? So in the Middle East, there are no democracies. There are only kingdoms, right? So all the oil-rich countries don't have democracy. Then how are we to discuss macroeconomic policy in that particular framework? Okay, obviously we will need something else over there. Okay, so our discussion of macroeconomics and the political biases that need to be taken into account presuppose democracy. Okay, and this needs to be kept in mind. Now the paper
Sir,
argues, yes.
sir, what kind of political bias are we talking about?
If you had read the paper, it would have been obvious, but you will have to wait till the time we finish going through the paper.
Yes, because I was thinking like it's a political bias can even be possible when the budget is balanced, isn't it?
No, the kind of biases that we are talking about is possible only if the balanced budget principle is abandoned. And why that is going to be so, we are going to discuss. Political biases, when governments intend to balance budgets all the time, are very, very muted, if at all they are there. You will see as to how they cannot arise. Okay, as we go ahead. Okay, so what is
Yes,
the
sir.
balanced budget? That is, government expenditures are exactly matched by tax revenues, right? That's a balanced budget. All right. So we will see the political biases, why they are possible only if there are budget deficits. Okay. In terms of macroeconomic policies, if governments agree and stick to a balanced budget rule like they used to in the prior to the 1930s, you cannot think about political biases coming, okay, in the conduct of macroeconomic policy. Okay, we will talk about this as we go ahead. Okay, now, so what kind of political bias did you have in mind?
Sir, I don't know, like policy targeting
No, no, you use
and
the word, so you need to
yes, sir.
know.
Sir, I was talking about targeting, like monetary policy targeting, or you can say tax or you can say subsidies targeting. This kind of bias I was having in my mind.
Yeah, but if there is a balanced budget, that does not constitute a political bias on macroeconomic policy. No, politics can influence anything, right? But that is not what we
Yes,
are
sir.
talking about. We are talking about political biases in macro policy, nothing else. Okay. So,
Yes, sir.
so in the Buchanan and Wagner point out that in the US between 1961 and 1976, there was only 1 year of budget surplus. Okay, this is empirics, and just like we said in our recent memory, we have had no years of budget surpluses at all in our own country. Okay, and the total government expenditure to GDP ratio, not ration. I'm sorry, I just make that correction. Right? So the total government expenditure to GDP ratio increased from 32.8% in 1960 to 40.4% in 1976. And this is in the US. Okay, this is Uncle Sam. This is not a communist country by any stretch of imagination. And look at the numbers. They are shocking, I mean, as a ratio of GDP, if government expenditures have risen to 40%, that's a shocking figure in a free market economy, in a so-called free market economy. Okay, now how exactly Buchanan and Wagner arrive at these numbers is not so clear. According to me, these numbers are on a very, very high side, but there can be no doubt that there was a phenomenal rise in the government expenditure to GDP ratio in the from the middle 60s or early 60s to the late 70s. Okay, and this is really, really surprising. Okay, okay. Now, and at the same time, there was a large amount of inflation in these years. Okay, and the consumer price index rose by over 90% in the same period and accelerated more or less in step with deficits. From our basic macroeconomics, we know that this is only to be expected in some sense. Okay, okay. So what are the numbers that they are pointing to? They are pointing to number one, high inflation, and they are pointing to a secular rise in the G2Y ratio. Okay, and right in the beginning, I had said that one of the important role of political systems, they have many important roles, but from a macroeconomic perspective, one of the most important roles that the political system in any country plays is to bring about a consensus on the G2Y ratio. Okay, a wildly fluctuating G2Y ratio could potentially be a recipe for disaster. Okay, okay, and the fear that these authors are pointing to is, with this phenomenal rise in the G2Y ratio in a capitalistic society and high inflation, what the hell is happening? Okay, how can we explain this phenomena? Okay, this is not expected. Okay, because if the political system has given you a optimal G2Y ratio, why should there be a secular increase in the G2Y ratio over 15 years? There is something wrong here. Something somewhere is failing. Okay, is it the politics that is failing? Is it the economics that is failing? Or what is happening? This is a puzzle that needs to be solved.
Sir, I had a doubt.
Huh.
So instead of having an optimal G to Y ratio, shouldn't the target be a fiscal deficit target like we have right now? Because your optimal G to Y ratio can depend on that year's taxation rate,
No, no,
taxation
no.
structure.
Baba, we are talking about a long run G to Y ratio. The political system must throw us a G star, an optimal G to Y ratio, which is driven by taste and preferences of the population, as is articulated through a political process of competitive politics. Okay. And ultimately, this competitive politics throws up a long run optimal G to Y ratio. Obviously, this G to Y ratio has to be thought of in terms of a tax to GDP ratio. Because we cannot have a situation where an optimal G to Y ratio is 40% of GDP, while the taxes are only 35% of GDP. That will give you a permanent kind of deficit of around 5%. But that does not seem to be sustainable. I mean, what deficits are sustainable? There is an algebra there. Have you studied that algebra about sustainable deficits, growth rates, and all
Yes, sir, some hand waving formula like the
that?
GDP growth rate should be higher than the long run interest rate.
Ama. Yes, yes, yes. There is a little more math involved in that to come to those conclusions. But those are much later theoretical models, which can be empirically validated, and you can come up with some numbers also. But remember, this paper is being written in 1976. So all your economics or all your macroeconomics that has come after 1976 did not exist at this point in time. Okay, okay. Um, so if the political system is unable to give us a G star and a T star, that is optimal G to Y ratios and optimal tax to and the implied optimal tax to GDP ratio, sensible conduct of fiscal and monetary policy itself is not possible. You will agree with that, right? Because unless there is a consensus on that, how the hell do you do anything at all? Okay, okay. So a general consensus of the population on a G2Y ratio uh, is a prerequisite for any sensible macroeconomic policy to be done. Without that, then we are actually in no man's land. Okay, okay. When we formalize this a little bit in terms of a model, maybe it will be a little clearer. But as of now, this is the best that I can do to explain this. Okay, think about all the macroeconomics that you have studied. Do you think anything in macroeconomics is possible without there being a long run G to Y ratio which a society has agreed upon? If that is not there, if a consensus on the G to Y ratio breaks down in some sense, like it did in the Soviet Union, then you have a complete breakup of society, right? The Soviet Union collapsed. The one macro reason that could be given is that the G to Y ratio was too high, and they just did not have a sustainable system of collecting taxes to be able to fund that. Just hold on a minute. Yeah. Hello. Yes. Very difficult to figure out rubbish calls from calls that are important. I'm sorry. I really apologize for that. All right. So you can think about many countries who were in crisis. The prime example being the Soviet Union, where a societal consensus on G to Y broke down completely, and then that entire system collapsed. Okay, or you can think about the UK in prior to Thatcher. Okay. Okay, so Margaret Thatcher comes to power and says that the UK economy needs to shift to a much lower G2Y ratio, and Thatcherism and all that. Okay, it is said that she was influenced by the Austrian school, von Weizsäcker being one of her main, what shall I say? I wouldn't say advisors, but she was greatly influenced by the writings of von Weizsäcker. Now the traditional neoclassicals and the Austrians. So you have a whole lot of economic schools of thought which actually argue for a much lower G2Y ratio. Okay, a government should spend on items that have high externalities. This is agreed by all, right? What should the government spend on? Education has high externalities. Defense, obvious externalities. Healthcare, obvious externalities. So for the set of people who have great faith in the functioning of markets, okay, this list of items is small. Okay, and for that section of economists and politicians who believe that the market mechanism does not function properly, this list of items on which the government should spend is a little larger. But if the difference in these two groups of people is very, very large, and competitive politics is played on some kind of extreme ideas about the G2I ratio, you will have a political breakdown and a breakdown of the economic system. Okay, which a large number of people thought that Thatcher would actually destroy everything. Of course, she came out of that with flying colors. But even over there, the reduction in the G2I ratio was not to the extent of 10%. No, that's too much. Okay, it was much smaller. But she insisted that the G2I ratio is too high and our society cannot sustain that. Okay. So this is the way it works. So you think about this, that countries where a consensus on the G2I ratio is not possible, you will have a series of crises. Okay, because macroeconomic management itself will become impossible. Okay. Do you agree with this point of view, or of what is it that the political system should throw up for the macroeconomists to take for granted? And I would always argue that that is a G2Y ratio and an implied tax revenue to Y ratio. Okay, this is an important point that needs to be kept in mind. Any questions on this before I go ahead?
Sir, but at least a tax to GDP ratio cannot be predetermined, right? It depends on how well your economy is doing in that.
No. It has to be. If there is a consensus on the G2Y ratio, then whatever it takes to match that G with taxes is an imperative. A country cannot be run on the basis of this is my list of expenditures. I don't really care from where I'm going to get the money. That is being in la la land. You cannot even run your household on that basis, ever. What makes people think that they can run the country on that basis? It is complete foolishness. Can you run a company or a household on the basis that we will make the expenditure first and then we'll start thinking about how we are going to fund it? It's not possible, no? You will get bankrupt. So when countries face crises, what happens? They get bankrupt. Greece, for example, that society was bankrupt. Okay, we will talk a lot about Latin American countries where these problems were so large that the Southern Cone countries were supposed to be complete basket cases. Okay. Okay, so this is an important thing that we need to figure out. At the very basics, we cannot be fooled into thinking that we will always be able to borrow from the younger generations and fund our current expenditures. Okay, this thinking is fundamentally flawed. It depends on that later inflation will reduce the debt and high growth rates in the future will make the management of these debts very easy. These are two assumptions that very, very rarely inflation may actually, you may be thinking right about that, but if I think about tomorrow that I'm going to win a lottery ticket and run my household on the basis of that assumption, I'm heading for disaster. No, so if my household is going to head for disaster with such wishful thinking, I refuse to understand what makes countries think that they can run the country in this way and not head for disaster. There can be no economic logic to thinking in this way.
Hello, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, one question. If I am a voter, I would always support that my GY ratio increases. But will I support that if my taxation increase?
We will
Suppose
talk about
before
that
voting.
as we go on. That's where we are going. So your question is going to be answered in a few slides. Okay. Okay, let's go ahead.
Thank you, sir.
Now, elected politicians enjoy spending money on projects that benefit their constituents, and they do not enjoy taxing the same constituents. This is basically what you are saying, no? Correct. So,
Yes, sir.
and by the looks of it, the data that was just presented about the deficits and inflation in the US, they did not live up to the apparent Keynesian percepts. They did not match deficits of recessions with surpluses of booms. So, in your undergraduate macro textbooks, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, standard Keynesian process, ISLM, blah blah blah, this basically tells you that if you are in a deficit, if your actual output is lower than potential output, run a deficit. If your actual output is greater than a potential output, run a surplus. That is what you are taught in macroeconomic texts in your undergraduate, if I'm not wrong. Correct? Okay, but that does not seem to work. And why that does not happen is exactly what Buchanan and Wagner are talking about now. So the simple logic of Keynesian fiscal policy had demonstrably failed in its institutional application to democratic politics. So they are saying, if you look at American data for over 16, 17 years, you had only 1 year of surpluses and 14, 15 or more years of deficits. It is very difficult to argue that for those 14, 15 years, actual output was actually lower than potential output. And why are they saying this? On top of that, they're showing you inflation data, right? So very clearly, in many of the years in which you actually had deficits, you had actual output exceeding potential output and therefore the inflation. You see the point that is being made. And where the failure of the system is being identified. Okay. Yes, this is clear. Huh? Okay, so let's go ahead. Now, then the question arises, then why do politicians behave in the way indicated? Possibly they largely do so with the expectation that voters will support them. Now, then the question is, why do voters support politicians who behave irresponsibly in the fiscal sense? Now, okay, so let me say this. If you look at models which study electoral cycles. Okay, these things are figured out in a rational expectations framework, and the answer arrived at over there are slightly different from the, or rather, the questions asked in an electoral cycles literature are slightly different from the kind of questions we are asking in this course. Not that the electoral cycles literature is any less interesting, because remember, in most countries, the US and large parts of Europe, and in many underdeveloped countries like ours, elections are largely predictable. Right? In the US, they are completely predictable. In UK style democracies and continental democracies, they are a little less predictable, but there is no uncertainty as to when an election will happen. Unexpected elections can happen, but that's a rare phenomenon. Okay, so they take advantage of elections being largely predictable events, and they do event studies. In some sense, they do event studies around elections using fiscal and monetary policy indicators. Okay, but that is not the way we are going. We are going in a slightly different way because we are asking slightly different questions. Now, so what is there in Keynesian economics that generates fiscal responsibility is the question that is being asked. And answer is being provided in this paper. A regime of continuous deficits with subsequent inflation, along with a bloated public sector, can scarcely be beneficial to anyone other than government employees. And this is a very wonderfully written sentence, which indicates the inherent thinking of Buchanan and Vladimir. Okay, that a secular rise in the G2I ratio is unprecedented. It just cannot be explained on the basis of anything. Okay, other than the benefits that government employees will get from a very bloated public sector. Okay, all right. Yet, why does the working of ordinary democratic process seemingly produce such a regime? Now, this conundrum, or in using terms of corporate finance, this anomaly or this puzzle needs to be resolved. So we have to point out, or we have to identify the exact place where there is an institutional breakdown. Firstly, is there an institutional breakdown is the question. If there is, and an institutional breakdown is the reason for such secular rises in the G2I ratio, then it has to be pointed out in a clear fashion. Now, firstly, they say that the economic and political regimes were very different in the 60s and 70s compared to what prevailed in the 1930s. There is an extra 9 over there. I am really sorry. Oh my God. I can't be making such ridiculous mistakes. Yeah. All right. Okay. So the point is that the political regimes were very different in the 1960s and 1970s compared to what prevailed in the Great Depression of the 1930s. What was the economic and political setting for the idealized Keynesian economic policy? So these are the questions that arise. Remember, in the 1930s, the balanced budget principle was the general principle that was widely accepted both by economists and governments. Okay. Now, see, the Keynesian policy recommendations were clear and simple. Okay. In a depression, effective demand may be increased only by increasing government spending, And this can be accomplished only if government increases its rate of outlays relative to the rate of its revenue withdrawal from the economy. Deficit creation offers the only available means of increasing output and employment. Obviously, when you are in a depression, monetary policy doesn't work, so we don't have to say more about that. Okay, and it is the government budget that needs to be expanded. The deficit may be financed either by money creation or by issue of public debt. Ideally, money creation is preferable. This is case in SLM, and this story carries forward even in our more sophisticated models of Keynesian, the more rather new Keynesian macroeconomic type models. Okay, now. So when inflation was the danger, budget surpluses were equally advised as the appropriate policy by Keynes. In this sense, the Keynesian principle was wholly symmetrical over the business cycle. The use of government budget was a double-edged weapon. Okay, during depressions, the stream of expenditure should be expanded. During inflations, they should be contracted. Now, remember this. Very early on, we had said that if you have a stable G2I ratio, then if you do this over the cycle, the G star, that is the optimal G2I ratio, doesn't change. Because you are expanding slightly when you are in a depression, you are contracting slightly when you are in a inflationary situation, and on the long term, the G star, the G2I ratio remains the same. Do you see the point? So as long as the policy is symmetric over the cycle, the conduct of policy does not change the G2I ratio that is optimal or the long run G2I ratio. You agree? Yes? Okay. So fiscal policy was equally effective in constraining inflation or depression. Monetary policy, by contrast, was alleged to be effective in an inflationary environment. It could not do anything in a recession, of course. But inflation control was very important in. Monetary policy was very important in inflation. But we are not so bothered about monetary policy. Our focus is more on fiscal policy. So Keynes, in his writing, was addressing his professional colleagues. His main aim was to influence and modify policies of national governments. Okay, now, what were his assumptions about men who make choices for the nation, that is politicians, and about the processes through which these choices were made? Now, so when, at the time when Keynes started talking about a way out of the depression, remember that a balanced budget was the convention and the consensus. So he had to break that consensus and then provide a reason as to why government should come out of the balanced budget rule. Okay. His biographer, Roy Harrod, coined the term presuppositions of Harvey Road. Now, this is a very interesting term, that is the presuppositions of Harvey Road. That is, this was Keynes's presupposition, that is, the government of Britain was and always would be in the hands of an intellectual aristocracy who would use methods of persuasion. That is, there are some enlightened people in Britain who would influence policy irrespective of who was in power. So for him, whether it was the Conservatives or the Labour Party or whoever, it was not a non-issue. He ultimately believed that there are these group of so-called intellectual elites who would use methods of persuasion and influence policy. Now, and these group of elites would not act as competitors in a democratic environment. Okay. Moreover, no bias need to be introduced as between public and private sectors, because the appropriate dividing line would continue to be determined by the same group of wise men, guided by their own vision of a broader public interest of the community as a whole. Now, this statement can be taken to mean that ultimately the size of the government, as obvious in a G2I ratio, these group of intellectuals would cut across party lines and influence everybody and create a kind of a consensus on the G2I ratio. Okay, so these things were also, I mean, why will intellectuals not be competitive? Why will the left or center economists not want the right of center economists to lose their jobs? Okay, Keynes was of the belief that economists are very reasonable people, intellectuals are very reasonable people. They will discuss amongst themselves, come to consensuses, and ultimately it doesn't matter who the hell is in power. These intellectuals would ultimately govern policy. Now, Keynes believed that the small group of enlightened people who make economic policy will tend to act in accordance with public interest, even while this may run afoul of constituency pressures. Now, this was his belief. And his biographer has gone through his writings and tried to articulate this belief of his. And in the paper also, they refer to many writings of both Roy Radner and Keynes himself, to persuade the reader that this actually was a core belief that Keynes had. So political decisions in democracies are made by elected politicians who respond to desires and demands of voters. So irrespective of what Keynes thought, this is something that is obviously true in democracy. Now, in democracies, there is no center of power where an enlightened few can effectively isolate themselves from continuing constituency pressures. So the first thing that Keynes overlooked is that as democracy matures, okay, you are never going to have the kind of economic policy making that he had in mind. Okay, there is no intellectual center of power anywhere. Okay, where he believed that the intellectual aristocracy would be the real center of power, and he saw himself as one of those intellectual aristocrats whose job it was to influence government policy. Okay, the fact that he worked so hard to break the consensus on a balanced budget itself makes you wonder as to why he thought like this. Because it is, after all, the earlier intellectual aristocracy that had put in place this balanced budget story, right? That he had to defeat, both analytically and otherwise. Okay. Now, Keynes argued persuasively that spontaneous coordination of economic activities through the system of markets would not produce overall stability, and that a market economy is inherently unstable. Okay, very, very much different way of thinking than the standard neoclassical economists. To achieve stability, Keynesian policy has an allocative bias towards a larger public sector and a monetary bias towards inflation. Now, this is a statement that Buchanan and Wagner make, and they have to now convince us that this is true. That is, Keynesian policies over the business cycle in a democratic setup actually produce a bias towards the larger public sector and a monetary bias towards it. And obviously, Keynes introduced what can be called an interventionist bias. That is, the governments have the knowledge and the wherewithal to stabilize the economy. That is, to bring output as close to potential output as possible. So if you believe that the government has an understanding of the economy and have the tools at its command to actually force deviations from potential output back towards potential output, is what could be termed as an interventionist bias. National expectations, people tell you that this interventionist bias is completely misplaced, right? Because both fiscal and monetary policy in perfect markets cannot move real variables. Okay.
Sir, in one of the previous slides, it was mentioned that money creation is preferred over public debt. Why is that, sir?
Why do you think? So if I create money, what happens?
Leads to inflation.
No. Arey yaar. So if I create public debt, what happens? How do I
Payment
create
of
public debt?
interest.
No. How do I create public debt?
Borrow from the public.
So why should the public lend to you?
You will offer them a good interest rate.
Yeah. Why should the public believe that that is doable? So you are basically borrowing against future tax revenues, correct? Ultimately.
Correct.
Is that right? All government borrowing is ultimately a claim on future tax revenues. Do you agree?
Yes, sir.
Correct. Now, let's not get into that's why I touched upon the Ricardian equivalent story when I began. You understand? Now, if I don't borrow, but I print money, then what happens? Then who is the government indebted to, sorry.
The central bank.
Correct. Now you see, these were days when the central bank, if you have to run a deficit, okay, see, in a balanced budget story, there is no problem at all, right? So unless you have the money, you cannot spend. Now you are saying, no, but you need not have the money to spend. So what are the options that you have? You either borrow from future generations, that is, you borrow on the basis of future tax revenue, or you borrow from the central bank. And Keynes said borrowing from the central bank is better, but why are you going to put the future generations into trouble? Borrow from the central bank, after all, it is just a book entry. Okay. So that is why. You see the point?
So, but doesn't money printing have larger implications on the general public?
What?
Inflation. I mean, the inflationary
Oh yes.
pressures are high on the entire economy.
But then everybody has to see that inflation will arise, no? In fact, think about this way: a government that keeps borrowing wants inflation. Isn't that right? Because in real terms, your debt will go down, right?
Yes, sir.
Right. So in simplest terms for the Keynesians at that time, we are talking about really old times. So at that time, you cannot start arguing about central bank independence, this, that, and the other, right? So when did Keynes write this book, General Theory? You can Google it.
1936.
Correct. in 1936. So, we should prevent ourselves from superimposing later economic insights and concepts onto the earlier economists who did not have all that at hand at that time. They had a general understanding of many of these things. Okay, but these ideas were not so well articulated in those times. Okay.
Yes, but just aside, I mean, in the current circumstances, public debt is preferred over money creation, right?
Why?
I don't know. I
Why
mean,
do you
isn't
say
that the
that?
general perception
Is there?
among
Is there? I mean, how do you know? Is this an outcome of theoretical models, or has somebody visited the Himalayas and sat in Tapa and come up with this?
Sir, because inflation is already high just now.
But then putting large claims on the future taxes you are going to collect is a good thing.
Sir, either way, there is no free lunch. If you are not paying interest, you are.
Yeah. So then, how do you prefer one for the other? For Keynes, it was very simple. That I am in a depression. Okay, inflation is not my problem. Okay, and the government has to run a deficit to move actual output closer to potential output. Okay, and therefore I prefer money creation. In any case, you see the point. I think on this there should be no confusion. Okay, we are talking about principles, not particular situations. Okay, all right. Now, so Keynesian policies is centered. What is this centered? Jesus. Typing is getting more and more terrible by the day. Keynesian policy is centered on the use of government's budget as the primary instrument for ensuring maintenance of high employment and output, that is, actual output being as close to potential output as possible. The implementation of these policies required both the destruction of former principles of balanced budgets and the replacement of those principles by principles that permitted imbalance that was necessary for Keynesian budgetary manipulation. So you had to break the back of a balanced budget principle and say that we should allow deficits, because it is only then that budgetary manipulation is possible. So obviously, Keynesian economics is what we call an interventionist bias. We talked about this. Keynesians suggest that when exogenous shocks force the economy off its expansionary path, no corrective devices are predicted to come into play. Hence, government intervention follows almost as a moral imperative. Okay, the rational expectations people and right of center people won't agree with this, but that's okay. The notion of an unstable economy whose performance could be improved through manipulation of public budgets produced a general principle that budgets need not be in balance. Okay, so first he had to demonstrate that economies are unstable inherently. Very Marxian. In fact, A.K. Dasgupta has a wonderful piece on Marx and Keynes. So I hope all of you have heard of A.K. Dasgupta, one of the most important economists that India has ever produced. Is Partha Dasgupta's father. Okay, and I would say that he is one of the most prominent economists that India has produced. Quite unfortunately, in our education on economics, nobody ever refers to anything that is written by A.K. Dasgupta, which is a tragedy. Just for your information, some years back, Professor Nachne has edited the complete works of A.K. Dasgupta. They are available in our library. So and has written on a large number of issues, of course. So, the Keynes had to sell this idea of an unstable economy. Okay, which of course the neoclassicals did not believe in. They said, no, 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 this is inherently a stable system. Okay, so in that sense, Keynes had a common view of the world, as did Marx, in a broad history of economic sense. Okay, there would be years of deficits and there would be years of surplus. These deficits and surpluses being necessary for, as well as indicating the enactment of macroeconomic management. Come to think of it from a Keynesian perspective, if the budgets are in balance year after year of the year, there is no macroeconomic management at all. No, the government is spending the money that it collects, give or take errors. That's fine. But there is no fiscal policy in the modern day sense as such, if you are in a balanced budget regime. Okay. So now, Keynesian economics did not destroy the principle of a balanced budget, but only lengthened the time period over which it applied. It did not seem to change the fiscal constitution within which economic policy is conducted. That is, the old balanced budget rule said that you have to balance the budget every year. Keynesian economics, on the other hand, says no, you don't need to balance the budget every year, but over the business cycle, the budget should be balanced. Okay, very clearly, Keynes was very much against continuous deficits. In fact, any macroeconomist would be completely against continuous deficits. Okay, and of course, Buchanan and Wagner present data where you have continuous. Now, a politician in a democratic society can be viewed as proposing and attempting to enact a combination of expenditure programs and financing schemes that secures him the support of a majority of the electorate. Now, this is the way macroeconomists or those who model politicians look at the problem. That is, various political parties have a list of expenditure items along with the amounts, okay, and a proposal of taxes or financing schemes, and he will try and put this in front of the voters and get elected. Okay. Given that public services enter positively into the utility function of citizens, public expenditure itself will secure support for the politician. Now, so what are public services? Those items of those goods and services which will be underprovided by the market. That is, for example, anything that has a very large positive externality will obviously be underprovided by the market. Do you agree? Right? This is basic microeconomics. Okay. So if public services enter positively into the utility function of citizens, public expenditure itself will secure support for the population. Obviously. Education, health with high externalities, defense, extremely high externality. Okay, any other items that you can think of with high externalities, it's there. Okay, now. Taxes, however, will reduce disposable incomes, thereby reduce support for the politician. In a democracy, for given preferences and fixed tax institutions, the budget will be expanded so long as a majority would prefer the public services to the private goods that they have to sacrifice due to taxation. This is simple. Right? So how far would you carry G? You would carry G as long as the marginal benefits of that G equal the marginal disutility that taxes are going to impose on society. So this is how a optimal G would be arrived at. Okay. The size and composition of budgets can be viewed as a product of the preferences of politicians, constituents, and the constitutional institutional rules that can constrain the political system. That is, politicians cannot be allowed to say that I will give you free electricity, I will give you free this, free that. Okay, that is highly irresponsible. So there will be constitutional and institutional rules that will not allow politicians to do that. They would say, no, you cannot promise this. Tell us from where the money will come. Now, to the extent that these constitutional institutional rules are not strong, then the politicians can promise anything and get away with anything and take the country to ruin. Okay. So this is about how that optimal G is going to be arrived at, and the implied T. We will do a little bit of modeling about this in my next class. So with balanced budget rule, any proposal for expenditure must be coupled with a tax proposal, correct? Now, what would happen if the requirement of budget balance were eliminated? So this is the story about the balanced budget rule. So that there is politics, you agree upon a G star, that G star gives you a tax, you have to balance your budget. So then if you want a high G, then you must get large tax collections, and therefore this will play out in a particular way. So if this is the constitutional mechanism under a balanced budget rule, then we know how that functions. So it is in this sense that I said that in a balanced budget rule system, macroeconomic policy will not be influenced by politics. There will be politics in the identification of G. That will be there. But as there will be no interventionist fiscal policy, because you must have a balanced budget, there will be no political influence as such. Agreed? This is the response to the first question that was. Okay. Now, consider the situation of a budget surplus in an inflationary situation, because this is what Keynes's system advocates, right? That you must have a surplus when actual output is greater than potential output. This would imply an increase in tax collections without a corresponding increase in public spending, or a decrease in the latter without a corresponding decrease in the former. Right? So that's fine. Directly, budget surpluses create no gainers, only losers. Think about this. So in a democracy, who will support a surplus budget? Actually, nobody. A sophisticated citizenry should be able to see beyond these direct considerations and understand that the surplus was required to fight inflation. In a rational expectation framework, you immediately get this. People see the future, they see the inflation, and etc. So this is the sophisticated citizenry. This person is writing a Buchanan Wagner writing in 1976. In the late 60s, ideas about rational expectations were there in economics, but they had not come in a very big way into operational macroeconomics in 1976. That took a little more time. It would be necessary for voters to interpret the aggregate economy in the same manner that it is interpreted by economists, as well as to develop a relation between this aggregate pattern and their own well-being. This is exactly what rational expectation means. So if you standardly set up a rational expectations macroeconomic model, this is what that rational expectations model would build on. Okay, that voters will see exactly what the economists see, and there is no problem at all. Now, given that this is a matter of great debate amongst economists, it would be unreasonable to expect voters would be able to do this. So here they are saying that, well, it is too much to expect voters to see these indirect links and therefore they are obviously against the kind of rational expectations modeling that is done. They would say that there are information asymmetries. Voters will not be able to see, etc. Therefore, it is likely that the benefits of a budgetary surplus will to some extent be underestimated by voters, and this is all that is required. If voters underestimate the benefits of a surplus, obviously the surplus will have no supporters. The surplus would not benefit anyone directly and impose costs on some, if not all, of the population because they are paying more taxes. On the other hand, the use of revenue that might generate the surplus would directly benefit some, if not all, the population. To the extent that indirect costs and benefits are understood imperfectly, actions will tend to be based on direct costs and benefits. And the direct costs and benefits are clear. Budget surpluses would seem to have a weaker survival prospects in a democracy than in a social order controlled by white men. And this is the punchline. Okay. So in a democracy, a budget surplus has no friends. And we know exactly the reasons why it has no friends. Institutional biases against such a surplus are likely to be strong. I am doing very bad job of typing. I come in the morning at 7:30, 7:45, and I'm wide awake, and I start typing your slides, and I make these mistakes. Very bad. I'm really sorry about this. Okay. Now, consider the case of budget deficits in the face of unemployment. Budget deficits make it possible to spend without taxing. There are only gainers from such deficits, no losers. A democracy will pose no obstacle to deficit spending. It is possible for political bias to emerge in the decisions over the appropriate public-private sector mix. Now, because if you have continuous deficits, what is going to happen? The G2Y ratio will rise. Now, if the introduction of deficit financing creates signals for taxpayers that public services have become relatively cheaper than before, voters will demand a shift in the composition of real output toward publicly provided services. So think about it. Okay, now in the paper, they give you a small numerical example. You can go through it. I'm not going to reproduce it here on my slides. That you should read. So the basic idea is, if the introduction of fiscal deficit financing creates signals for taxpayers that public services have become relatively cheaper. Why? Because there is more of public services available to you now, and you're not being taxed. That means that public service is cheap, which is in a true sense, that is not true. But there is information asymmetry, and voters perceive that this is so. Then they will ask for a higher G2Y ratio. Okay, now, the true opportunity cost of public goods relative to private goods will not be modified by government actions, by budgetary actions by the government. So just because you are not collecting taxes and providing more public services does not mean that the opportunity cost of those public services have changed. No, they have not changed. You are only not collecting those taxes or not imposing those costs, but those costs have to be borne by society. But quite unfortunately, public goods will be perceived to be cheaper. There thus will be a clear bias towards expanding the size of the public sector in real terms. So therefore, instead of having a constant G2Y ratio, okay, with small changes over the cycle, you will have a secular rise in the G2Y ratio, which is what the data shows. Deficit finance, while possibly altering the public-private mix in the economy because of the generation of false signals, is unlikely to encounter political obstructions. No politician is going to say that, no, the true costs of public services you people are not observing, but they are high and the government cannot provide this free. So it's like the electricity situation in Punjab. Have the costs of electricity provision changed? No, but it is just provided free. It is crazy. I mean, all economists know that this is stupid. You can't provide electricity free to anybody. But still, nobody can talk against it. So this will not have any political obstructions at all. So the removal of a balanced budget principle in a political democracy ultimately will generate an asymmetry in the conduct of budgetary policy. Deficits will be generated, but to a greater extent than justified by Keynesian principles. While surpluses may sometimes result, they will result less frequently than required by Keynesian principles. The Keynesian paradigm creates an inflationary bias in a democratic setting. Governments respond more vigorously in correcting unemployment than in correcting inflation. Fiscal policy that is ideal for the ideal world need not be best for the world of practical politics. This suggests that the economist who seeks to be of assistance must become a political economist in a very real sense. So this is only his line. Now think about it. Step back a little bit and think about it. But after you had this very high inflation, which Buchanan and Wagner talk about, later inflation was defeated, right? And everybody moved to very low inflation in around 20 years after the period which Buchanan and Wagner are talking about. Is that right? Inflation was tamed in the advanced world, isn't it? You agree or you don't? Am I audible?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So my only point is, they are talking about what they observed. They obviously cannot talk about what they did not observe. Okay, they did not observe anything of the 80s and 90s where you had this very strong anti-inflationary successes. But for the underdeveloped countries and the southern cone countries, there was no success on inflation either. Okay, but for the developed world, you can say that late 70s, 80s, and 90s, a huge amount of success in curbing inflation. But that's a different story. But for now, their claim that the Keynesian creates an inflationary bias and a deficit bias in a democratic society setting is clear. Okay, I will stop here. Are there any questions?
Yes, sir. Sir, I have a question. So we do understand that there is a problem here clearly, but then what is the solution to this? Because you just can't go back to balanced budgets, and then if you spend, that will appease the voters, but if you tax, that won't. So what is the solution here?
That's the whole course, no? So you have to wait to the end of the course to see whether there is a solution.
So isn't the solution an independent monetary policy, an independent central bank? Because they can take care of the inflation.
Baba, we are talking about fiscal policy. Monetary policy is central bank. Fiscal policy is not central bank. Though we will say a little bit about fiscal policy, the course is about, though we will say a little bit about monetary policy, this course is about fiscal policy. The title of the course is Fiscal Policy and Stabilization, no? So I will be talking predominantly about fiscal policy. And we have to get out of this conundrum, no? So now we have to see international data, we have to see developed versus underdeveloped experiences. What are the possible solutions? Of course, we have to see that. That's where we are going. Okay, I cannot let the cat out of the bag just now, no? So you have to be a little patient and go through the course to see whether a solution at all arises. Okay, yes? Okay, but I implore you to read this paper.
Sir, I have just a generic question. Why the political economy arguments are hand waved in macroeconomics?
Can you talk a little loudly? I can't.
Why politics is hand waved in macroeconomics?
Who said it is hand waved? No.
I mean, nobody talks. If
Had it
not been hand waved, then this problem wouldn't be.
No. That is not true. That is not true. A lot of political economy models of macroeconomics are there, lots of them. I would think that Bharati is one of the persons who will be able to talk about this in some sense a little more clearly. Okay, I myself have done some work very long time back on electoral cycles and all that. And the papers that we are going to study are going to show you how the politics is there, how macroeconomists take care of this. Okay, so it depends on the question you are asking. So if the question you're asking needs bringing politics upfront, then macroeconomic models do bring politics upfront. To the extent that it is enough to be aware of politics while generating solutions, then it is pushed into the background a little bit when you ask a different set of questions. But how in your face the politics of this is going to be depends on the question that you're asking. Okay, so if you're going to electoral cycles, because then the politics is in your face, right? You know the election timings and all that, and how it can be manipulated to influence voters, etc., etc. So in the electoral cycles literature, the politics is in your face. So it is modeled absolutely explicit. In the kind of literature that we are dealing with, it will be modeled with a little more de-emphasis, but it will be there in the background. Okay, so it is not true to say that in macroeconomic modeling, political economy is not discussed. It is discussed very much. Okay, as we will see in the papers that we are going to read, and the entire electoral cycles literature and all that we are not getting into. That takes us to a slightly different view of the matter.
Sir, one more thing. Sir, the problem we are looking at here, that is of a perpetual budgetary deficit because politicians are trying to make people happy. I think, in my opinion, it is better explained through electoral cycles rather than what the explanation we are giving here. Because if you see, if it is the same government over and over again, they will have to bear the consequences of the deficits that they are generating. Like, for example, you generate a deficit for 5, 10, 15 years. Eventually, there is going to be a high inflation. There are going to be consequences which won't be popular with the voters. And then they are going to assign the blame to you ultimately, right? But then if there are electoral cycles, then you can always blame it on someone else. You can say that my predecessor was the one who did so much expenditure, and that's why these problems are coming in, and now I'll fix it. So I think that offers a better explanation.
No.
Sir, I would like to add here
Just a
something.
minute, let me respond to what you have said. So if macroeconomic policy as a tool to maximize the probability of being re-elected is the kind of story you are telling, okay, then the politicians know that high inflation will make them lose power, no? So, I think in the study of economics, the one thing that we should always guard against is intuition. Because intuition leads you astray more often than not. Okay, we need hard evidence and, as far as possible, consistent modeling. Both are important. And many times models actually give you unintuitive answers. That is why you need a model. If you can figure out everything by intuition, तो फिर model काहे का है? You see. So hold your horses. Maybe if I have time, I can expose you to a little bit of electoral cycles literature also, but I don't know. So we will see. I'm glad that questions are coming to your mind, but don't rush to the answers. They are not so obvious and simple. Yeah, somebody else was saying something. Yes,
So that adding to what Romit said, you know, if people knew that this sort of policies that the politicians are promoting or implementing would lead to a higher inflation. If that knowledge was that common, how would that affect the electoral process in that sense? Because the people who are making the decision are well informed about the consequences of the actions that they are taking. But if that information is common to the people who are voting for the implementers or the people who are there in the power, then how that debate changes all over again? I would like a bit
See,
clarity
very
on.
simple. So when you are modeling these issues of using government expenditures or taxes or whatever fiscal policy to influence voter behavior, okay, in a rational expectations framework, you will never be able to influence voter behavior with full information, correct? Your
Yes.
standard result will be that voter behavior cannot be influenced by budget. Let's say we are talking about fiscal policy. But if you say that how efficient governments are, now let me be a little careful here. So there is party A, party B. Okay. Party A says that I will give you Y amount of public services at a cost of, say, C. Party B says I will give you the same amount of government services at a slightly lower cost. Now, the costs of these public services cannot be seen by the voter, correct? But if you say that I introduce an imperfection here, an asymmetric information system here, where the voters become aware of the true costs with one period lag. You understand what I'm saying?
Yes,
So the
sir.
government knows the true cost. The voter learns about these true costs with a period lag. Then it is possible for political parties to influence voter behavior. But they cannot do this all the time. Why? Because the lag is there only for one period, right?
So there will be adaptation in
There will
future.
be that exactly. So the rational expectation story will go through, and the voters will learn, right? So, so to the extent that political parties need to compete, in the sense they have to convince the voter that they can provide public services at a lower cost. Correct. So this is fair competition. This is exactly what political parties should do. Because ultimately, government is providing public services. If one party can actually provide those public services at lower cost, they should win. No. Now, I don't want to give you the conclusion of how this modeling will conclude, but it does not conclude in a very decisive way. Okay. Why? Because announcements of taxes, etc., 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 are signals, right? That I am more competent, that party A is more competent than party B. So if you say that leading to a election, the government cannot have deficits greater than XYZ, then is that really beneficial? There is a lot of controversy on this. So in the electoral cycles literature, that the fiscal constraints must be put on governments in a year that is prior to an election. This is one story that actually comes up. But there are arguments against that as well. So those are the kind of solutions that are there. But that is not where we are going. No, we are going to the conduct of fiscal policy in a stabilization sense. So our focus is macroeconomic stabilization of the business cycle. that becomes a slightly different question. So let us not confuse questions. Okay? Yeah? That is a
Okay, sir.
different question. Can governments influence voter behavior? That's a different question. See, we don't have the ability to answer all questions altogether with one model, no. So we have to compartmentalize our mind. So the problem that we are dealing with is stabilization, not influence of voter behavior through the government budget. So our framework cannot answer those questions. That framework cannot answer the questions that we are asking. Okay. Okay, anything else? Or we can close for the day and meet on Friday. Okay. So please
Sir,
read the paper. Yeah.
sir, regarding the classes, sir, about five of us in this class, Paramila, Shantanu, Devesh, Shibanjan, and Akshita, we are retaking Krishnan sir's Econometrics 1 course. Sir,
I don't know how I am going to solve this problem. I am at it. Fabina is trying various things. She's talking to various people. So I hope we can solve this. Okay.
yes,
So
sir. We will be able to, sir, if it's possible to shift from Wednesday 11:30
can
to
you
1.
can you email this to Fabina?
Yes, sir, sure. I'll do it.
Because I need to leave now because it's 2.5 hours for me to go home, and we are having a faculty meeting today at 4:30. I'm in office, so I have to reach home at 4:30. So I'm a little constrained to take these questions today. Please write to Fabina. We will try and work this out. Okay.
Yes, sir, sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.